When you think about the animal kingdom, what do you see? Maybe it's vast herds on the savanna or the incredibly complex societies of insects. The truth is, the animal world is overwhelmingly social. But, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's a real puzzle. If survival of the fittest is all about individual competition, why on earth do so many species choose to live together? Today, let's try and solve that puzzle.
Okay, so you look at a picture like this, and your first thought is probably safety in numbers, right? But think about it from a purely individual, selfish point of view. A group means more mouths to feed, way more competition for mates, and it's a perfect breeding ground for diseases that can spread like wildfire. For social living to evolve over and over again, the benefits must be absolutely huge, powerful enough to outweigh all those very real costs. So, what's the evolutionary math that makes it all add up?
So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to nail down what sociality actually is. Then we'll do a little cost-benefit analysis. After that, we'll dive into a major scientific debate about how selection really works, introduce a truly revolutionary idea called inclusive fitness, and finally, we'll see how this all plays out with some amazing examples from the wild.
All right, first things first. We can't solve the puzzle if we don't define the pieces. The word sociality gets thrown around all the time, but what are we really talking about in a biological sense? Let's get a clear definition.
And, that definition is pretty broad, and that's on purpose. Sociality isn't just one single thing. It's a huge spectrum. It covers everything from a temporary flock of birds hanging out at a water source all the way to the lifelong, superstructured colonies of ants and bees. The key thing here is that it's about more than just finding a mate.
And that right there is the crucial point. There is no one-size-fits-all social group. The size of the group, how stable it is, the level of cooperation, it all varies immensely from one species to the next.
And this just illustrates that diversity perfectly. Even within a single group of insects, the Hymenoptera, you see this massive range. On one hand, you've got a paper wasp colony, maybe a few dozen individuals. But on the other hand, you have a honeybee hive with tens of thousands of citizens, all working together in this incredibly complex society. It's just wild. So, all this brings us to the core logic of evolution, which is really all about the trade-off. For any trait to stick around, the benefits have to outweigh the costs. Let's apply that thinking to living in a group. This is basically the evolutionary accounting. In the benefits column, the pros are pretty clear. You get better protection from predators, you can defend your territory more effectively, and you can even share childcare duties. But the costs column is just as real. You've got more competition for every scrap of food, a much higher risk of catching diseases, and, a big group is a much more obvious target for predators. For any social species to survive, that evolutionary math has to balance out in favor of the benefits.
Now, this cost-benefit balancing act leads us to one of the biggest, most fundamental questions in the study of animal behavior. When an animal does something helpful for another, who is natural selection really favoring? Is it the individual, or is it the group as a whole?
For a really long time, it was common to hear that animals do things for the good of the species. It's a nice thought, right? But in 1966, a biologist named George C. Williams basically said, hold on, that's just wishful thinking. He argued that natural selection is fundamentally selfish. It favors traits that help an individual's genes get passed on, period. A truly selfish animal in a group of selfish ones would just get taken advantage of and get outcompeted. And that powerful argument completely changed the conversation. This quote just hits so hard because it captures the force of that massive shift in thinking. It framed the whole problem in a new, much stricter way. If an animal does something helpful that's also costly to itself, there has to be some kind of payback for its own genetic legacy. So, how do you explain things like sterile worker bees who never reproduce, or a meerkat sentry who puts its own life on the line for the group?
Well, the answer came in a truly revolutionary idea that didn't get rid of individual selection, but instead, it brilliantly expanded it. It's a concept called inclusive fitness, and it gives us a whole new lens for looking at genetic success. Okay, so here's the big insight. Your genetic success isn't just about how many kids you have yourself. That's only one part of the story. We call that your direct fitness. It's also about the success of your relatives, who, of course, carry copies of your very own genes, and that's your indirect fitness.
So your total inclusive fitness is just the sum of those two things. Natural selection, then, favors any behavior that makes that total number as high as possible. And this is the key. Sometimes, the best way to maximize your inclusive fitness isn't to have your own kids, but to help a close relative have more kids.
This whole process is called kin selection. Think of it like this. Say you do something altruistic, like helping your sister raise her kids. Because she shares on average 50% of your genes, by helping her children survive and thrive, you are indirectly making sure that copies of your own genes get passed on. This amazing insight finally solved the puzzle of how seemingly selfless acts of cooperation could evolve through what is, at its core, a selfish gene-level selection process.
Okay, so that's all the theory. It sounds good on paper, but how does this actually play out in the real world, with real animals? Let's take a look at some cooperation in action.
Meerkats are the classic textbook case. In these little family groups, you'll often see subordinate individuals acting as sentinels or even as babysitters. They help the dominant pair raise their young instead of trying to breed themselves. So why would they do that? Well, usually the helpers are older siblings or other close relatives of the new pups. By helping out, they're maximizing their inclusive fitness, making sure their little brothers and sisters survive to pass on the family genes.
And cooperation isn't always about directly raising babies. In a lot of primate societies, like these Japanese macaques, social grooming is basically a kind of currency. Sure, it gets rid of parasites, but more importantly, it reduces stress, it forges alliances, and it maintains the social bonds that are absolutely critical for living in a group. It's an investment in a cooperative network that can really pay off for an individual down the line.
And this isn't just a mammal thing, not at all. You see the same pattern popping up all across the animal kingdom. Take these apostle birds, for instance. Here, groups of related birds all work together to build the nest and feed the young. And studies show that pairs who have these helpers are way more successful than pairs trying to go it alone. It's a perfect demonstration of kin selection in action.
So let's bring it all home. We've seen that social living is, at its heart, an evolutionary trade-off. And while those old ideas about animals acting for the good of the species have fallen away, the solution wasn't just pure, simple selfishness either. The concept of inclusive fitness brilliantly explains how cooperation, especially between relatives, can be a winning strategy for an individual's genes. Kin selection is the powerful engine that makes so much of the social world we see possible.
And that leaves us with one last thing to chew on. If the very foundation of cooperation is this mix of genetic self-interest and shared family legacy, what does that tell us about the nature of relationships, not just in animals, but maybe, just maybe, in ourselves as well?